Morning, everybody, and thank you for coming, for being here bright and early. It sure is early on a Saturday. I'm really excited to be the moderator of this first panel. I think we're going to kick this off with some really great, exciting papers, as you can see from your program. We have 4 presenters who are going to be talking about a topic near and dear to my heart, which is the history of espionage and intelligence. So I'm going to give you just a brief introduction to these 4 panelists, but lots of details about them are in the program, so I won't dwell on them. But first, we're going to have Katie Sherrod presenting on Operation TP Ajax. Next, we're going to see Cody Fueling with his presentation To the Brink on the Cuban Missile Crisis, followed by a second presentation on the Cuban Missile Crisis by Seth Carpenter Nichols. And Korey Nowels is going to take us home with a paper titled Combating an Independent Spirit. So I want to echo Dr. Weiner's encouragement for you guys to ask questions and give comments to our panelists once we finish. Recommendation, those of us, I know again our brains are probably stuck in still asleep mode. If you've got a question that's bubbling up for Katie as she goes, maybe jot it down so you don't forget it by the time the panel's over. I've been there before. I'm happy to welcome our first presenter. Katie, I'm sure, is a little nervous to go first, but she's got a great paper, and I'm excited for you guys to hear it. So.
Thank you. Operation TP Ajax, the CIA's first power trip. In 1951, the people of Iran elected Mohammad Mossadegh as their prime minister. The Iranian people were crying out for change in a country where they felt as if nothing would ever be different. They were poor, and there was little they could do about it. The biggest possible source of Iranian income had been British hands since 1908. This election and the subsequent relations between the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and Mossadegh led to a heightened sense of distrust between the Iranian government and the British government. When the British felt that their 51% stake in the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was being threatened, they had to take action. The British government obtained the help of the United States Central Intelligence Agency to remove Mossadegh from power due to the nationalistic agenda against the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The United States was brought into the fray due to perceived Soviet-Iranian connections and the communist threat. The fledgling democracy that had taken root was shattered by the overthrow of Mossadegh, and prior to our involvement in the coup, the United States and Iran had enjoyed a great relationship. In the years since then, the CIA has received backlash from both foreign and domestic organizations, resulting in an increase in the confidence gap between the American people and foreign governments. The CIA's involvement in the coup led to an increase of CIA power and created an atmosphere of distrust between the USA and foreign and domestic powers. The CIA operation was titled TP Ajax. Mohammad Mossadegh came to power during a time when Iran's political climate was already volatile. It had become custom for the leaders of Iran to allow themselves to be puppets for the British interest in Iran. This was due to their 51% stake in the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This company was responsible for the refinement of Iranian oil. The British knew if they backed Iranian leaders that they would still have influence in the government. They could work to cement their power within Iran and be sure to protect any British interest in Iran, particularly in the oil sector. When Mohammad Mossadegh was elected the Prime Minister of Iran, he posed a threat to British control of his oil due to his idea to nationalize the oil supply. This was the impetus for the British to create the plan to oust Mossadegh. Mossadegh, before his election to Prime Minister, had proved himself to be a man of honor who would rather do what he thought was right rather than what he thought best for his career. Historian Stephen Kinzer offers insight into the character of Mossadegh, noting that he was a visionary rather than a pragmatist, preferring defeat in an honorable cause to what he considered a shameful compromise. The moral righteousness that Mossadegh stood by made him an ideal candidate for prime minister in 1951. In a country where the people were crying out for change and wished for a greater influence on democracy, Mossadegh gave hope. There was a short time that allowed for Mossadegh to try and use his influence on the country that he loved so dearly. One of the first and most outrageous, in the eyes of the British, things he did was to nationalize the oil supply in Iran. Thus, they wanted him gone. Initially, the United States was a supporter of the Prime Minister in his actions. The British government had developed a plan to remove Mohammad Mossadegh through a coup d'etat. This plan was vehemently opposed by President Truman himself, and he insisted that there would be repercussions if the British government took action against Iran. President Truman had supported the Iranians' wish to nationalize the oil industry, But in 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected into office and changed the game. The British saw their chance, so they preyed on the fear that had been gripping the United States since the end of World War II, the communist threat to Europe. With the Soviet Union's Iron Curtain firmly in place, the United States worried about the spread of communism into the Middle East. With Eisenhower in power, the British stood a chance at garnering support from the United States for not only their part in negotiations with the Iranian government, but also in their planned coup should negotiations not go their way. Desperation came into the British government, and the Secret Intelligence Service, the SIS, developed a plan to overthrow Mossadegh. The SIS was the British version of the CIA. While there had been no prior reason to get involved in the Iranian-British struggle, talk of the Soviet Union gaining power in Iran armed the British government with tactics to create a situation in which the United States felt as though it had to step in. Talks began between the British and the United States to organize a successful coup in Iran. With the help of Kim Roosevelt, a CIA agent based in the Middle East, a coup was organized. The military coup that put into place the new officials was a combination of propaganda, covert financial support of the Shah, and working with religious leaders. The preliminary details of the plan to remove Mossadegh from power called for pressure to be put on the Shah, who was the monarch of Iran. This pressure consisted of telling him that if he refused to support the coup, that if he did not take leadership of the overthrow of Mossadegh, that he would bear responsibility for the collapse of his country. He was to appoint General Zahedi, a brigadier general in the Iranian military, as the new prime minister of Iran through a royal firman. Though there were many hiccups in the plan, the firman was not delivered at the correct time, the Shah fled the country, Roosevelt was committed to a successful coup, and eventually success came, and Mossadegh was removed as prime minister, and General Zahedi was in place. Originally, the firman was supposed to be given to Mossadegh by the commander of the Imperial Guard, but someone had warned Mossadegh of the coup. The commander was intercepted and arrested. General Zahedi avoided arrest by shuttling from safe house to safe house, and the Shah fled the country because he knew that the coup had failed. Mossadegh, believing that the coup had failed, asked that everyone return to their lives as normal. Zahedi took advantage of this by meeting in secret with religious officials, and with money supplied by the CIA, they created a new plan. They hired people to pretend to be part of the Communist Party and to create a communist revolution. These people, along with other actual communists, started attacking any icon of capitalism in the streets. Then, other people, who were paid to act as Shah supporters, incited the Iranian people to defend their towns from communists. Then Zahedi used his military authority to take back the streets of Iran and the government buildings. Mossadegh fled, but later turned himself in to the authorities. It was only after Mossadegh turned himself in that the Shah returned to Iran from Italy. It is important to note that even before the coup was successful, United States government officials were at best skeptical of any Soviet influence within Iran. The British believed that the United States was taking the communist threat too seriously, and that they needed to see there were more alternatives to Mossadegh than just communism. Even those within the United States who were working with the CIA to create a successful coup saw that at the time there was not much evidence of Soviet involvement. Monty Woodhouse, an SIS operative at the time, admits to magnifying the communist threat and downplaying the need of the British government to regain the oil industry in Iran. There was also the fear of a destabilized Middle East. The United States saw Mossadegh as reckless and destructive. Although the United States was supposed to be defending the free world from communism, they in fact were aligning with the British in order to allow the United States in on the Iranian oil industry. This is reflected by the Shah's resolution of the oil dispute. American companies actually gained a 35% stake in the consortium. The United States had effectively taken the help Iran desperately needed to help them rise from the control of the British and given it to the people who had been exploiting them for years. What was the effect of this on Iran? The coup itself was confusing to the Iranian people. There were some people who believed that Mossadegh had staged his own coup in order to show the strength of his government. Others were wondering about the Shah and his firmans. Were they real? And if so, why did Mossadegh not acknowledge them? These questions, plus military presence in the streets, widened confusion. There were different factions vying for the public support during this time, which split the public opinion on who should actually be in charge. Eventually, the public sided with the Shah and because his firman had taken Mossadegh out of power, and General Zahedi was the new prime minister. Although Mossadegh had lost some support during 1953, he still had been popularly elected, and he probably would not have fallen out of power except for the fact that Britain and the United States stood behind the coup. When he returned to the United States, Kim Roosevelt was explaining all the detail that had gone into the planning of the Iranian coup. He noted that should the CIA take further actions in other countries by organizing a coup, the United States should be sure that they had the backing of the citizens and the army of the country in which the coup was to take place. Even with this warning from Roosevelt, there was no stopping what the American government used the CIA for next. Even in the years since the Iranian government still exercises restraint when dealing with the United States, and even now the United States does not have diplomatic relations with Iran. The United States has effectively orchestrated the demise of a democratic government and created a new source of power for the United States government. What came out of this was a sham of a government. The United States and Britain put someone into power whom they knew they would be able to control. The Shah and the new Prime Minister relied heavily on the United States and Britain for support of their government because it was these two countries that had allowed them to come to power. Even with the support of these two world powers, the government in Iran did not last long. The Iranian Revolution that began in 1978 forced the Shah to leave the country. The American people were unaware of what their government had done. What the Iranian people had seen in action and had grown up learning about, the United States government had swept under a rug. While it had been what they called an open secret that the United States had participated in the removal of Mossadegh, it wasn't until 2013 that they published the secret documents containing the United States' role in the coup. This use of CIA power damaged the United States' image. In the years to come, the CIA would work on coups based around expelling governments that were hostile to American interests. These coups, some of which were successful and some of which were not, would damage the reputation of the United States in the foreign sphere. The expansion of power given to the CIA would also create a credibility gap between the government and the people of the United States, as seen in the appointment of the Church Committee. The American people were alerted to the problem of the CIA participating in activities that were on the edge or morally and ethically wrong. In the years since these operations, the United States has seen an increase in the number of conspiracy theorists and a widening of the credibility gap in regards to the government. The motives with which the United States government acts are questioned due to past occurrences such as the overthrow of the Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. The CIA is looked at with uncertainty due to their track record of not having reliable information and creating issues between the United States and foreign powers. The Operation TP Ajax was the first CIA operation of its kind. It created an era in which the CIA had powers that had never before been attributed to it. The CIA's impact on American citizens' view of the government was heavily influenced by its actions in foreign governments, the first of which was in Iran, with the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh. Thank you.
I'm Cody Filling, and I'm going to talk to you guys about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I'm part one of our Cuban Missile Crisis presentation. And today we're just going to take a little peek behind the Iron Curtain. The events of the Cuban Missile Crisis, during which the Cold War between the American and Soviet superpowers nearly went hot, were, according to some historians, the most perilous in the planet's history, and the closest belligerent forces have ever come to engaging in mutual thermonuclear conflict. The 13 days of the crisis, which took place during the latter half of October 1962, hallmarked the pacifying diplomatic intentions of the American and Soviet heads of state and showed that cooperation between capitalists and communists could occur in the interests of the preservation of their respective systems and states. But as with all great events in history, the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis is key, so we must first understand just what started it all. Well, the success of Sputnik in 1957 is known for bringing the United States and the Soviet Union into the space race, with humankind taking, as Neil Armstrong famously put it, a giant leap into the future of technology. But this romantic contest to conquer space before the Soviets could was analogous to a dangerous American campaign to close what Eisenhower would call a confidence gap that emerged when Sputnik caused the Eisenhower administration to fear that the Soviets were leading the West in nuclear armament. So to reinforce Western interests, President Eisenhower secured the unanimous approval of NATO states positioned intermediate-range ballistic missiles, or IRBMs, in Europe, but only Britain, Italy, and Turkey agreed to host them. In October 1959, 15 Jupiter IRBMs were arranged to be placed in Turkey. John F. Kennedy, who took over the operation upon his inauguration in 1961, agreed with Eisenhower in the belief that the Soviets would use the Turkish IRBMs to justify arming Cuba. Eisenhower also thought Mexico could have been on the table. If Turkey could attack across the Black Sea for the United States, then Cuba could attack across the Gulf of Mexico for the Soviet Union. So 3 months before the crisis, Kennedy urged U.S. officials to see what needed to be done in order to remove the missiles, telling Undersecretary of State George Ball to get on the ball and progress the issue. Ball, after discussing with the Turkish ambassador, however, allied with other State Department officials and decided to not remove the missiles so as to preserve American-Turkish relations. So as we know, there is a degree of Soviet reciprocity in placing missiles in Cuba, because Cuba, a communist state only 93 miles from the tip of Florida, whose leader had recently had a bad experience with the United States, Bay of Pigs, was prime real estate to host intermediate-range Soviet missiles. Nikita Khrushchev wanted to gain from the venture, but it is said that the one thing that he didn't want was war. So it was a strategic move, but he wasn't looking for a belligerent interaction between the United States and the Soviet Union. So the Soviet nuclear involvement in Cuba was as follows. Medium-range ballistic missiles, or MRBMs, which had a range of 600 to 1,000 miles, which is far enough to reach Washington, D.C., were unloaded in Havana in the 2nd and 3rd weeks of September. And 6 bases were prepped to house them at San Cristobal, Sagua La Grande, and 3 bases at Guanajuato were erected to house IRBMs, which have a range of up to 2,200 miles, which would grant these missiles access to most of the continental United States. Here's a map that Kennedy had on October 16th, 1962. You can see several radii. The largest one is, of course, the ones that were at Guanajuato, and you can see that with these missiles, they were able to reach places like Los Angeles, certainly Miami, New York, Chicago, the nation's capital, Washington, and even Fort Wayne, which is where we are. Scary stuff. Okay, so why did they place the missiles in Cuba? Well, to be honest, one of the principal ideas was to reciprocate the actions that were taken in Turkey. Turkish missiles placed, so Cuban missiles were placed. And the placement would be relatively inexpensive. And involvement with Cuba would capitalize certainly on Kennedy's earlier Bay of Pigs fiasco, which was just the previous year. And the Soviets could bargain with the Cuban missiles later in order to secure contested issues. Of course, none of these is actually to start a war. It's not prepping for war. I mean, it's possible that it could go to war, so of course you want to be prepared for it, but it's not setting the framework to commit to nuclear conflict. There's, of course, a fifth thing also, which is sort of this communist honor for the Western Hemisphere, whereas Cuba in like 1959 just finished its transition into becoming a communist state, in the West, 93 miles off the tip of Florida. There's a certain level of pride in the political system that was proving thus far to be successful in Cuba. So in order to address the issue, Jack Kennedy created ExComm, which is the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. And after much deliberation and a lot of arguing, they decided that there were 2 options. There was peaceful diplomatic removal of the Cuban missiles, or there was removal by force. And despite their disagreements, both sides of ExComm agreed that the missiles in Cuba had to go. And interestingly, the Soviet Union, of course, after the United States discovered, using a U-2 plane, the missiles, they released 2 separate ultimata for the United States, which was horribly confusing for the people in the White House, because this first one, which was that the U.S. had to agree not to intervene militarily in Cuba, it was received on the evening of October 26th through a secret channel. However, the following morning on Moscow radio, they heard that the U.S. also had to agree to evacuate its analogous weapons from Turkey. So now they had two, not necessarily conflicting, but certainly separate conditions that had to be met in order for the Cuban Missile Crisis, which just started, to be resolved. And of course, as we all know, it was resolved, but first I think that we should take just a look at what exactly these Turkish missiles were. Okay, so there were Jupiter missiles placed in Turkey, and many people, including Eisenhower, though he endorsed placing missiles in NATO states, felt some reluctance to these specific Jupiter missiles and how they're set up. Because, of course, for some reason, I'm not entirely sure why, they were exposed and above ground. These nuclear missiles were open. And the Jupiter missiles already were becoming obsolete as ICBMs were becoming more effective than IRBMs, and Polaris submarines, which are, of course, mobile, are able to sink to deeper depths and are able to avoid enemy detection, were proving to be much more effective in the Mediterranean, which, of course, Turkey can be close to. And Turkey recently, in 1960, and of course, we're talking about 1962 right now, experienced a coup d'etat. So there was some questioning as to if this new government would be as cooperative with the United States, if there could possibly be a following coup, which happens from time to time. So there was some concern. Additionally, the Jupiters were too slow in alert reaction, as painstaking and dangerous procedures needed to be made in preparing the missiles for launch. So if we needed these Turkish Jupiters like on the fly, you couldn't count on it because they're extremely dangerous, and loading them and preparing them for launch is also in itself extremely dangerous. However, you can't just remove things like this, you know? A lot of Turkish money had already been committed, and cancellation would make the United States and NATO and Turkey and all these other nations look weak compared to the Soviet Union. As we all know, a lot of the Cold War is seeing who's stronger, or, you know, walking around and pretending who has the bigger stick, you know? Turkey, additionally, would be insulted. And there's some talking about the Turkish taxpayer wouldn't quite understand why these missiles were committed and then pulled out, which would certainly shake the faith that Turkey would have in NATO. Additionally, you don't want to do this because Turkey is a wonderful geopolitical ally. I mean, it sits there between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, you know, as a Strait of Bosphorus going through, and it's neighbors with the Soviet Union. It's good to keep Turkey on your side and not have Turkey decide to switch over to its friends in the Warsaw Pact. So really, the Kennedy administration had to make a decision as to how they were going to handle this crisis. So Kennedy did some thinking, and eventually they landed, XCOM did, on an idea, which would, of course, returning to the two ultimata that we had at the beginning. The United States did agree not to intervene militarily in Cuba, so no more Operation Zapata, which is the Bay of Pigs. And they did so publicly, announcing this, and privately with negotiations mainly through John F. Kennedy's brother, RFK, you know, Bobby Kennedy. They also decided that the United States should agree to evacuate its analogous missiles from Turkey. So the Soviet Union ended up getting what it wanted, and the United States also ended up getting what it wanted. Turkey, however, maybe not so much. So this is just a really, really simplified rundown of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we have missiles in Turkey, right, as you can see. And then we have analogous missiles springing up in Cuba. While I didn't discuss this, there was, of course, a fleet of Soviet ships heading in toward Cuba. And blockade was erected, or a quarantine was erected by the United States. And then through negotiations, they brokered a deal that these missiles would go. As long as these missiles went, then we no longer need to have the ships. And of course, we can pull down the quarantine zone. And through this, they decided that they didn't have to actually take the alternative route, which of course, if not diplomacy, it would be military action, really kind of the only two options, which would be Washington gets nuked, and then Moscow gets nuked, and then everybody else kind of gets nuked. And this would be deeply unpleasant, and because of this, President Kennedy's National Security Advisor, Mick George Bundy, did not misrepresent the Jupiter missiles in Turkey, but he declared them to have been worse than useless. They were so bad that they actually caused really unpleasant situations for everybody involved. So where did this crisis take us? Well, internationally, we can see that Cuba was promised no more U.S. invasion, so that's good for the Castro regime and for the Cuban government. Turkey received stronger protection via ICBMs. They did capitalize on the Polaris submarines, and they did float around in the area relevant to Turkey, which caused Turkey to feel, yes, Turkey lost its Jupiter missiles, but it received the protection of these stronger, more capable missiles that are mobile via the Polaris submarines. And then the USSR, of course, no longer feared Turkish missiles because there were no longer Turkish missiles. And the US no longer feared Cuban missiles because likewise the Cuban missiles were removed. So the situation took relations between the Soviet and American heads of state to a high, and it fostered a mutual understanding between the two leaders, Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy. Both states had been willing to grant concessions in favor of the other, perhaps opening a new doorway to the nullification of Soviet-American relations. But with President John F. Kennedy's assassination, 13 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Premier Nikita Khrushchev's removal the following year, this new passage of understanding was transient at best, and hopes of a mutual movement to ease the Cold War ended with the respective administrations. It is impossible to speculate what would have happened had the two heads of state remained in office. Perhaps more understandings between the United States and the Soviet Union would have transpired. Perhaps not. Such speculations cannot rewrite history, and after the crisis in Cuba, there would be another quarter of a century until the Cold War would end. Until then, the Iron Curtain would remain impenetrable. Good morning. Part 2 of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm Seth Nichols. The title of my paper is The Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy's Quest for Peace. President John F. Kennedy is argued to be the most influential president of the United States in the 20th century. From his charisma, energy, and his progressive politics, Kennedy launched the nation into the best it could be. However, October 1962 proved to be the ultimate test of Kennedy's presidency in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Though Kennedy faced pressure from the military-industrial complex to attack Cuba and the aggressive policies of the USSR, Kennedy compromised with the rival superpower to expand their nuclear missile sites to avoid a nuclear war. Despite mixed reactions, Kennedy displayed amazing leadership because he kept the American people and the world safe and changed the Cold War mentality and proved that the United States can succeed by communication, not warfare. On November 8, 1960, Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts was the youngest man elected president. Despite Kennedy's close victory over Richard Nixon, his youth, establishing the International Peace Corps and the new frontier of being a war hero in the Navy and launching the United States space program made Kennedy a popular president for many, especially by young people. However, Kennedy faced a formidable challenge in the communist world. Prior to Kennedy's presidency, America struck fear about the spread of communism. After World War II, the CIA was created to combat communism internationally in the 1950s. Left-wing dictators in countries such as Iran and Guatemala were overthrown by coups orchestrated by the CIA. Afterwards, oppressive but anti-communist dictators were appointed and supported to protect American interests by the containment policy by U.S. diplomat George Kennan. The policy of containment states that communism can be prevented from spreading if the United States imposes its will and it can be defeated. On New Year's Day in 1959, the military dictator of Cuba and long ally of the United States, Fulgencio Batista, was overthrown by communist forces led by Fidel Castro.
Under Batista, the Cuban economy was controlled by American entrepreneurs and the mafia, where businesses included gambling, banking, trade, and oil refineries. In addition, the CIA helped create Batista's secret police force called BRAC. The United States retained a Navy base on Guantanamo Bay. With Cuba being 90 miles off the coast of Florida and losing a powerful ally, Cuba was suddenly seen as a dangerous threat. In the 1960 election, Kennedy attacked the Eisenhower administration, allowing Cuba to become communist in the spread of its influence. Kennedy accused Nixon and Eisenhower for creating a missile gap. The Soviet Union, Kennedy claimed, was now winning the Cold War by producing more offensive weapons and becoming more economically superior than the United States. Kennedy made Cuba a big campaign issue, and if elected, Kennedy promised he would be more aggressive against communism. After the election, Kennedy approved a CIA coup called the Bay of Pigs to overthrow Castro, led by 1,400 exiles to reestablish a U.S. allied government. However, the Bay of Pigs was an embarrassing failure for President Kennedy in April 1961. Despite Kennedy being furious at many, he announced that he would take full responsibility and would move on from the mishap. Kennedy received an 83% approval rating from the American people afterwards. Disappointing 17% came from the likes of Ronald Reagan, who claimed Kennedy abandoned the exiles. After the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Kennedy lost trust in the CIA and the military. At the Vienna summit in June 1961, Kennedy clashed with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Both men refused to give in to the other to protect their interests and simultaneously expand their political influences abroad. Kennedy increased goodwill alliances in Central America and involvement in Southeast Asia, as Khrushchev established a closer relationship with Castro and tightened his grip over Germany and East Berlin. According to Kennedy's Attorney General and younger brother Robert Kennedy, in an interview with John Bartlow Smith, the Soviet premier was unstable. Khrushchev would be friendly and unfriendly, friendly and unfriendly. So he kept everyone on the hook. He was friendly in 62, but at the end of 62, he was sending missiles into Cuba. For some time, the Soviet Union created missile sites and shipped nuclear missiles into Cuba. Kennedy thought it was a tactic by Khrushchev to convince him to invade Cuba so Khrushchev could retaliate by invading West Berlin. Unfortunately, this plan proved to be more crucial. On the morning of October 16, 1962, National Security Advisor George Bundy gave Kennedy startling photographic proof of the Soviet Union building offensive missile sites. Kennedy informed his brother Robert immediately, and he called a meeting with his staff, which included the Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and the Joint Chiefs of Staff Maxwell Taylor, George Wayland Anderson, and Curtis LeMay. Further analysis showed that the 90 nuclear missiles were on the island nation, 30 of which had the same devastating power as the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima 17 years earlier. The range of the missiles could strike any location at any time on the Western Hemisphere, from Mexico City to Washington, D.C., and apparently Fort Wayne. And the Union kill consumed those present at the meeting, and World War III seemed imminent. Numerous options were pondered. Some were peaceful, as creating a blockade around Cuba, as others included an airstrike. Kennedy wanted to avoid military action, but did not rule out the possibility. In an individual meeting with UN Representative Adlai Stevenson, the president stated the possibility of an airstrike or any similar measure to make the missiles ineffective. But Stevenson urged Kennedy not to rush into a decision. Stevenson told Kennedy, "Let's not go into an airstrike until we have explored the possibilities of a peaceful solution." On October 22, 1962, Kennedy gave his famous live address to the nation. Kennedy showed strength, caution, and was blunt on the facts about the Soviet Union lying to the White House about not partaking in aggressive activity or expanding communism. Kennedy said that the nuclear weapons that the Soviet Union was sending to Cuba was an act of war, and he announced, "Our policy has been one of patience and restraint, as befits a peaceful and powerful nation which leads a worldwide alliance. We have been determined not to be diverted from our central concerns by mere irritants and fanatics. but now further action is required, and it is underway. And these actions may only be the beginning. We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the cost of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory may be ashes in our mouths. But neither shall we shrink from that risk at any time. It must be faced. Kennedy issued 7 steps to prevent any more aggressive action. The first step was to quarantine Cuba to prevent any more offensive buildups from the Soviet Union. The second and third steps increased surveillance on Cuba and declaring any launch of nuclear missiles as an act of war. The fourth and fifth steps were the increase of security in Guantanamo Bay and invoking 2 articles of the Rio Treaty. The sixth step announced that the UN was officially involved in monitoring the crisis and would take action against the Soviet Union if they continued. The final step was Kennedy bluntly calling out Khrushchev to stop engaging in the buildup and the shipment of nuclear weapons to Cuba, and the whole world would be watching his every move. Kennedy promised to the American people, our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right, not peace at the expense of freedom, but of both peace and freedom. Here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world, God willing, that goal will be achieved. Thank you and good night. Kennedy exposed the importance don't jump the gun on me. Kennedy exposed the importance and the nature of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was not about warfare, but about saving lives. In the 13-day crisis, Kennedy was fighting an entirely different war, one to keep the American people safe. Chris Matthews wrote in his biography on Kennedy, he wasn't fighting a war, but trying to prevent one, signaling to the other side the terms on which peace could be maintained. As Kennedy gave his address, his audience increased enormously as the whole world watched what would happen next. To put pressure on Khrushchev, after further negotiations with Khrushchev by letters, a deal was met. The Soviet Union agreed to cease operations in Cuba in exchange for the United States to remove missiles from Turkey and Italy and not invade Cuba on October 28th. Secretary of State Dean Rusk said, "We were eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow blinked. Kennedy's plan to keep the American people and the rest of the world safe was successful. An equally challenging foe was the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the majority of whom urged Kennedy to invade Cuba and launch airstrikes. Such actions were risky and placed the world in danger of a nuclear war. The most outspoken of whom was General Curtis "Bombs Away" LeMay. Robert Kennedy said in an interview that LeMay kept urging the president bomb the hell out of him. In meetings, LeMay often ridiculed Kennedy aside from demanding an attack. LeMay told Kennedy, "You're in a pretty bad fix at the present time." Kennedy shouted back, "Well, you're in there with me, personally." Robert Kennedy in an interview claimed they just want to go in and drop bombs on people, even after the Cuban Missile Crisis. 2 of the chiefs of staff were really mad. One of them suggested that we go and bomb them anyway on Monday. And the other said, "We've been sold out." The most dramatic suggestion was to stage a fake terrorist attack to have a war with Cuba. This was called Operation North Woods, and it was approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Kennedy rejected the plan. Kennedy's ability to compromise with the Soviet Union led to an enormous shift in the Cold War. Though the blockade of Cuba was still operational, both the United States and the Soviet Union agreed that no aggressive action will follow in order to ease relations between the East and West. Kennedy signed a nuclear test ban treaty on October 7, 1963, with Nikita Khrushchev, and approved plans to pull troops out of Vietnam. Reactions to Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis were mostly positive. Kennedy received a 12-point increase of popularity at 74%, and Democrats kept control of the House and Senate in November. Author Harold Davis praised Kennedy for his peaceful leadership and changing the Cold War, saying, "Crisis over Soviet missiles in Cuba brought home to the American public more than any other post-World War II event. The central meaning of the Cold War as a fight for peace evoking was, as to be expected, a variety of different reactions. But these reactions, however varied, expressed in no uncertain terms the fundamental American readiness to fight for peace with justice, whoever their lights as to what a just cause is. More recently, Craig Campbell praised Kennedy for limiting the Cold War, changing his past war hawkish policies, and putting the nation on the track of mellowness and harmony. Not all opinions, however, were positive. Kennedy, according to his historian Stephen Ambrose, Eisenhower was angry that Kennedy had pledged not to invade Cuba for the evacuation of Soviet missiles, and vented his frustration to Richard Nixon at his winter home in Desert Palm, California. Conservative critics such as Strom Thurmond, Kenneth Keating, Donald Bruce, and notably Barry Goldwater accused the Kennedy administration of being too soft on communism, mistreating military leaders, and withholding facts on the amount of missiles that the Soviets had sent to Cuba. In the 1964 election, challengers Nelson Rockefeller and Senator Goldwater stated that Cuba was still a threat and branded Kennedy's policies as self-defeating. The biggest critic was General LeMay, who said Kennedy's refusal to invade Cuba was the greatest defeat in our history. Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis inspired the judgment of future presidents. On September 18, 1970, President Nixon received a memo about a possible construction of a nuclear missile base on Cienfuegos Bay in Cuba. Later that month, Nixon and Henry Kissinger met with Soviet diplomat Anatoly Dobrynin and urged him to abort the construction of the nuclear submarine base because it was in violation of Kennedy's agreement in 1962. After threats of a public confrontation with the Soviet Union and an invasion of Cuba, the Soviet Union stopped their operations in October. Nixon followed up with opening up relations with China and the signing of détente with the Soviet Union in 1972. On November 15, 1982, President Reagan sourced Kennedy to defend his proposal to increase defense spending at 46%. On November 19, 1985, President Reagan met Mikhail Gorbachev in Geneva. After a peaceful conversation, both men agreed to have 2 more summit meetings. Reagan expressed his irony of working alongside the Soviet Union in his autobiography, "Yet, I knew it hadn't changed. If anything, the world was changing, and it was changing for the better. The world was approaching the threshold of a new day. We had a chance to make it safer and a better place for now and the 21st century." Reagan, like Kennedy, was thinking in the long term. Reagan was successful in his own foreign policy matters, which resulted in the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union 2 years later. In conclusion, the leadership of President John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis was extraordinary because he kept the world safe. He changed course and began communicating with his Soviet rival. When panic struck, Kennedy stayed calm, showed strength, and took defensive action. As Kennedy stood firm in his peaceful agenda, Khrushchev agreed to take the missiles out of Cuba, as Kennedy did in Turkey and Italy. Kennedy succeeded in his promise to keep the nation safe and sought to make the United States the model of the world in diplomacy, equality, and the ability to work with the rest of the world without bloodshed. In a brief presidency, President Kennedy changed with the times and did his best to move the nation progressively in the right direction. Thank you.
I'm not talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Combating an independent spirit, how the CIA's sense of operational autonomy has stymied congressional oversight. Since its creation in 1947, the Central Intelligence Agency has grown from a lowly bureaucratic filing system into one of the most sophisticated intelligence services in the entire world. The evolution of the CIA can be attributed to dual forces. One being the growing necessity of information required of the United States as it ascended to the status of superpower after the Second World War, and the other being the relative autonomy from regulating forces that the CIA has enjoyed since its foundation. Over its history, the CIA has repeatedly been criticized for activities that were conducted under the proverbial nose of both government regulators and the American public. These activities include, but are not limited to, activities such as non-consensual human experiments, enhanced interrogation techniques, assassinations, and the training of militant groups. While the CIA's autonomy did allow it to develop into a more effective intelligence gathering apparatus, A tradition of hands-off oversight in regards to the CIA's activities has led to continual systemic abuses, which have persisted despite many attempts at reform. The CIA was born out of the conclusion of the Second World War, after the defeat of the Axis powers left the United States and the Soviet Union as the world's two opposed superpowers. This necessitated a profound shift in military planning and intelligence gathering. This reality was reflected in the policies established by American security officials through documents such as NSC 68 in 1950. National Security Council Report 68 defined the growing antagonism between the United States and the Soviet Union and called for a containment policy to curb the spread of Soviet influence. Besides establishing the need for overall American military buildup, NSC 68 also facilitated the development of centralized intelligence by calling for improvement and intensification of intelligence activities. While the language of NSC 68 ambiguously called for the creation of broader intelligence services, the Central Intelligence Group that evolved into the CIA was formed as a result of President Truman disbanding the Office of Strategic Services in 1945. The CIA itself was formally created by the National Security Act, which was passed in 1947. Importantly, the early CIA and the CIG that preceded it both bear little resemblance to the agency of today in terms of its power. According to historian Amy Ziegert, the CIA was intended to both be an intentionally weak disseminator of information that would control what she calls a confederacy of information among the competing interests of the Army, Navy, FBI, and State Department. Congressional authorities began exerting the control over the CIA during the early years of its creation as the Central Intelligence Group, and would continue as the organization evolved into the Central Intelligence Agency. Congressional oversight during this period primarily manifested itself in the appropriation of funding. As the CIG group funds were concealed within the budgets of the State Department as well as the Army and the Navy. As a result, congressional leaders argued that after its creation by the National Security Act, the CIA budget should be clearly identified by the House and Senate Appropriations Committees. The leaders of the CIA, however, argued that this threatened national security and successfully lobbied for their budgets to be reviewed by smaller ad hoc committees away from the rest of Congress. This proficiency for lobbying would become a common theme in the relationship of both of these two bodies going forward. The precedent of hands-off congressional oversight would continue as the CIA gained more clout as an influential intelligence service. After the official creation of the CIA, systems were also established to oversee the activities of the new agency, but the committees tasked to oversee the CIA were also charged with the oversight of the armed forces as a whole. During its early period, the CIA did not answer directly to a regulating body that was solely tasked with its examination. This broad jurisdiction afforded the CIA more autonomy than would have been allowed by a committee specifically designed to monitor intelligence. The committee that oversaw the CIA during this period were also largely controlled by some of Congress's most senior members from both parties who benefited politically from supporting the CIA because it conveyed that they were strong on security issues. Additionally, these same congressional leaders retained control of their respective positions for long periods of time, especially in the House of Representatives where members were not subject to term limits. Historian L. Britt Snyder illustrates this using the Senate Armed Services Committee as an example. From 1951 until 1969, that committee had only two chairmen, a Democrat and a Republican serving back-to-back. Therefore, oversight of the CIA was limited during the early years of the agency due to the interests of powerful, long-time serving politicians conflicting with the job of conducting oversight. As the Cold War developed during the 1950s, the agency's activities began to rely on covert operations. It was during this decade that the CIA saw the expansion of covert operations around the world. For example, in 1953, the CIA toppled its first government, when CIA agents led by Kermit Roosevelt conducted covert operations that facilitated the removal of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and the installation of an authoritarian government controlled by the Shah. This process would continue itself throughout the Eisenhower administration, with overthrows of other reformist governments like the Arbenz government in Guatemala. With the scope of CIA clandestine activities developing rapidly by the 1950s, it is important to consider how overseers in Congress reacted to these changes during this period. The rise of the CIA in the 1950s had actually been partially facilitated by the legislative branch through the passage of the Central Intelligence Agency Act of 1949. This act allowed the CIA to utilize confidential fiscal and administrative policies that exempted it from many of the normal limitations on groups utilizing federal funds, and allowed the CIA to suppress organization, functions, officials, titles, salaries, or numbers of personnel employed. Portions of this law also encouraged the conduct of covert actions by allowing the CIA to utilize defectors and other people it calls essential aliens outside of normal immigration policies. Historian David M. Barrett argues that oversight committees members argued that the exponential growth of the CIA and were well aware of the disproportionate share of agency resources, almost 2/3, that were being utilized for covert actions, which they labeled as Cold War activities, rather than utilizing those funds for intelligence purposes like espionage and analysis. Therefore, the 50s as an era was characterized by congressional oversight that overtly sanctioned covert activities outside the realm of simple intelligence collection and analysis. Interestingly, the 1950s also saw posturing by Congress to illustrate their political control over the CIA. Tactically, Congress sought to exert oversight by applying political pressure to the leadership of the CIA itself. Almost from the CIA's inception, the Director of Central Intelligence was called upon by committees to respond to perceived intelligence failures, such as the Soviet atomic test in 1949, the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956, the launch of Sputnik in 1957. In 1958, DCI Dulles appeared a surprising 27 times before 16 different committees, many of which did not represent an official oversight function of the CIA itself. Additionally, real reform of the oversight apparatus was attempted during that decade, most notably through the efforts to create a single joint committee that would aggressively oversee agency affairs, that was spearheaded by Senator Mike Mansfield. Ultimately, these attempts were quashed by the swift reaction of DCI Dulles, the Eisenhower administration, and influential pro-CIA members of Congress. As a result, the framework of intelligence oversight would remain unchanged going into the 1960s. The 1960s represent an important decade for the trajectory of CIA activity and the failure of intelligence oversight. The decade began with a debacle that exposed CIA covert tactics, the Bay of Pigs. According to Barrett's research, Congress had never been previously briefed over a CIA-led covert operation, but individual members of Congress were informed on the invasion ahead of time. Despite this, the failure of the invasion signaled a new round of debate for the establishment of a joint committee to oversee the CIA, this time spearheaded by Senator Eugene McCarthy. Like the previous attempts in the 1960s, however, these calls for reform were rebutted by the leaders of the Oversight Committee's system, as well as the administrations of both Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. Therefore, little institutional change occurred to the oversight apparatus during the 60s in a similar manner to the developments of the 50s. Despite a lack of institutional reform, the 60s would still prove pivotal for the future of oversight. This is due to the broader political climate of the decade, combined with CIA operations in Vietnam. These would lead to the controversies that fueled calls for reform during the 70s. The degree of autonomy afforded to the agency during the 50s manifested itself as a willingness of the CIA to engage in ever riskier operations in the 1960s. The Pentagon Papers would later reveal that the CIA had aided in the coup to overthrow South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem, who the United States officially supported. Other abuses occurred throughout the decade as a result of poor oversight. These include the attempted assassinations of other foreign leaders, such as Cuban President Fidel Castro and Congolese Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba. The CIA also engaged in domestic activities, such as the interception of mail, non-consensual drug experiments, and even consulting with organized crime. While these issues would not come to light until the early 1970s, the distrust of the executive branch sparked by America's involvement in Vietnam would lead to a visceral reaction that resulted in calls for real reform. The 1970s brought an atmosphere that was ripe for reaction against the established oversight system. This atmosphere resulted from both the Watergate scandal, which brought the government under scrutiny in general, and the leaking of intelligence secrets to the media. In 1974, the New York Times published a scathing article that exposed many of the CIA's abuses of the previous decade. The extent of domestic surveillance was especially stressed by the article, which claimed people were targeted, information was collected on them, and it was all put on tape just like the agency does with information on KGB agents. Due to the resulting outrage, the Senate created the Special Select Committee to investigate intelligence activities, or simply the Church Committee, after its chairman, Senator Frank Church, to investigate the claims leveled against the intelligence community. The scope of the Church Committee's findings were significant. Besides confirming many of the allegations made by the New York Times about the CIA, the Church Committee exposed many large-scale systemic abuses within several intelligence agencies, including the FBI, Army and Navy intelligence, and of course the CIA. While the testimony of the Church Committee revealed many abuses in great detail, its lasting impact was actually found in the reforms it inspired. One of the first substantive changes that was the passage of the Hugh Ryans Act of 1974, which required the president to review all major CIA covert actions and to report the findings to Congress. The committee's recommendations also led to the creation of an permanent intelligence oversight committee in both the Senate and the House to directly review the actions of intelligence agencies. The other branches of government also reacted to the committee. President Ford, by way of executive order, prohibited assassination plots of foreign leaders by the CIA in 1976. Ford also established an official intelligence oversight board within the White House. The courts were also given their first consistent system of intelligence oversight as a result of the Church Committee, through the passage of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which required special federal courts to approve wiretapping requests. Therefore, the Church Committee did make significant strides in facilitating reform that changed the landscape of intelligence oversight. While the Church Committee did usher in creation of several new institutions intended to hold groups like the CIA responsible, systemic abuses still occurred, and groups like the CIA have actively modified their activities to avoid scrutiny from officials. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, the CIA would occasionally find itself embroiled in controversy, such as the agency's involvement in the Iran-Contra affair. Despite this, renewed calls for expanding oversight in the CIA would not prove effective until after the events of September 11, 2001. In the wake of 9/11, the internal structure of the CIA and the intelligence community as a whole was resurrected to address intelligence failures identified by the 9/11 Commission. The position of Director of National Intelligence was created in 2004 to consolidate the heads of the intelligence community in one person who could be more responsive to Congress. Despite efforts like these to make the CIA more efficient and responsive, abuses by the CIA continue to fuel discussions of the organization today. Today, controversy still lands squarely on the shoulders of the CIA, specifically on recent programs involving CIA-conducted advanced interrogation techniques of suspected terrorists. Again, as has been the precedent of the CIA's overseers, controversy compelled investigation. In 2014, the Senate Intelligence Committee report on CIA torture revealed a failure of oversight on this issue. The report concluded that the CIA impeded oversight by refusing to supply Congress with information related to the interrogations and by refusing to respond to direct inquiries. Additionally, the report found that CIA officials had intentionally misinformed both Congress and the White House on the effectiveness of torture interrogation techniques. Therefore, reforms regarding oversight have still not succeeded in addressing the fundamental issue of preventing systemic abuse of an independently acting CIA. The reality of congressional oversight of the CIA reveals alarming trends that have remained intact despite the reforms of the Church Committee. The CIA still continues to willingly avoid or refute efforts by congressional officials to oversee their activity. This trend can be traced all the way back to the origins of the CIA as a poorly regulated advisory body and was exacerbated by a tradition of independent operational capacity afforded to the agency. This sense of operational entitlement, therefore, represents the main obstacle to reform facing the oversight system. Future attempts at reform would be wise to consider the relationship between the CIA and its regulators thinking critically on how that relationship inherently affects cooperation and the agency's responsiveness to the society it will protect will be critical. That one.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you very much to our 4 presenters for kicking off the conference, and I hope you all learned something that maybe you didn't know about the extent of covert activity by the CIA during the Cold War, and that we should maybe be grateful for the skillful negotiations so that we never experienced the, how did you put it, Cody, unpleasant effect of nuclear war. So I'm going to turn this over to you. It looks like we have about 15 or 20 minutes for some questions for our presenters. So anybody have anything they would like to know further? Dr. Schuster.
Hi. First of all, great presentation. I enjoyed all the papers, and this is what I like about conferences. I always feel like I'm learning something new. My question, and it's for all of you here, you know, with it seems like the CIA, when it acts, even when it has successes, like Iran was considered a success, Guatemala a year later was considered a success. Even when it has successes, there's often a legacy of in hindsight, it looks like it was a failure, right? So overthrowing the government in Iran led then directly to the Islamist revolution in '79, American hostages, and that's where we are now. Guatemala threw it into generations of civil war, and when things go, and that's when things go right. When things go wrong, it could be like the Bay of Pigs, which then further pushes Fidel Castro into the arms of the Soviet Union, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I guess my question is this. Since you've been studying it, and I imagine you've been reflecting on these things, is it possible, or how might it be possible to be able to balance action on the part of the CIA with prudence? Or are those two mutually exclusive? Can you have action, covert action, without all the oversight and still be prudent? Whoever wants to take a shot at it, it's kind of a conception.
I guess, I mean, specifically, with what has happened in Iran since the overthrow of Mossadegh, it seems to me that, I mean, to put it kind of bluntly, maybe if we kind of kept our nose in our own business, things would have gone better, especially in Iran. You see, democracy was taking a hold, and while there seemed to be a communist threat, the only reason that Mossadegh was even speaking to the Soviet Union was because he was facing, he wanted legitimacy. And because of this, the United States and the nationalization of the oil in Iran, Britain was putting a lot of pressure on the United States to not really legitimize Mossadegh's prime ministry.
I guess one of the things that might be useful to think about is, because if we're talking about the CIA, which is a foreign intelligence service, what do we really want out of an organization like that? Do we want to be informed through espionage and analysis, or do we want an organization specifically tasked with covert operation? Because if that's their main purpose, we already have institutions for that. We have the conventional military that can do that in, I guess, I don't know if it's the right word for it, but in a more honest way, in a more open way. So I guess we just kind of have to ask, what is the fundamental purpose of the CIA, and does it really meet that through its actions?
Yeah, and Guatemala was mentioned a couple times. So in Guatemala, the Arbenz regime was turned over, and this was with President Eisenhower. And a lot of flack has been received by the CIA and the Eisenhower administration, sort of retrospectively, because a lot of analysis shows that they had sort of corrupt interests with the United Fruit Company placed in Guatemala, and they were interested in protecting the United Fruit Company's land from not being seized but compensated for financially by the Arbenz regime. So I mean, a lot of I mean, like some people may say, oh well, it's a necessary step in the Cold War. But I mean, just like with like Watergate, I mean, how do you not like have your faith somewhat shaken when you see institutions used or these methods used for personal gain? You know, I mean, United Fruit Company was extremely lucrative. It's Chiquita bananas today. I don't enjoy Chiquita bananas because of this, and I know it's and somewhat on the opposite side of the Cuban Missile Crisis, you may call successful because we didn't have to see what happened on my PowerPoint slide where the whole world blows up. You know, I mean, we're all sitting here talking about it, so we could say that this was a success, but in large part, it wasn't you know, exclusively like a secret organization. I mean, I guess XCOM was secret and the Turkish negotiations were secret. Johnson didn't actually learn about it until Kennedy died. You know, he was sworn in, and then in '63, Johnson, the vice president, learned about the Turkish missiles being negotiated. So I guess many times people may see the secrecy and the cloak and dagger as destructive and open to corruption because nobody knows about it. But on the other hand, oftentimes it's extremely effective, and the only way to do it without having to go through all this red tape. You know, sometimes it's easier to just cut the red tape and get it done because you're in a crisis.
My view of the CIA and their actions is very absent-minded because they're thinking about at the moment. They're not thinking about towards the future, and they don't understand foreign countries' cultures because not all countries are going to understand our democracy and our interests. So, which, you know, these coups were successful over Arbenz and Mossadegh. We pay for it later on.
Thank you.
With the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States lost its archetypal enemy, its boogeyman on the other end of the world. But yet we've seen in the last decade and a half, you know, a resurgence of these covert operations, a resurgence of military conflicts, and almost another containment policy. Would you say that the United States has rekindled or resurrected a kind of Cold War mentality against lesser forces, that it's effectively looking for a new fight to win and hasn't settled on anything that's really strong enough to fit the bill?
Wants to take that
I mean, certainly, you can watch documentaries like on Vice News, if you guys watch Vice News, about sort of this new Cold War with, you know, certainly dealing with Vladimir Putin and the situation with Ukraine and Crimea, where there's, and also relevant to what's happening in Syria, where we have sort of conflicting interests in Syria, and we have conflicting interests in what we believe to be Ukrainian autonomy and what they believe to be Ukrainian autonomy. And so certainly, I mean, we can see that the Soviet Union fell in like '91, right? But we don't see that Vladimir Putin's mentality, because he was, you know, a member of the KGB, and he's been the I almost said Soviet head of state, the Russian head of state for a significantly long time, and he has fraudulent elections. Certainly, Russians are going to be the stereotyped enemy in action movies for a long time, and then we always have China as well, which has become the capitalist communist marriage place between these two systems. And I mean, every time China's economy, you know, hiccups, you know, we talk about it, and every time it grows, we talk about it. So certainly, China, with our economic concerns dealing with manufacturing and imports and exports, they may be our early 1950s, late 1940s Soviet Union.
I guess in terms of like the conflicts of today compared to the Cold War, I think the question isn't really so much who the enemy is, but really like what the nature of the conflict is. because the Cold War was very much like a back and forth like dichotomy, like us, them. It was, clearly defined, cut and dry. This is America, this is the Soviet Union, separate spheres. But, I think the issues of today, while they aren't as clearly defined as that, or, even as easily like romanticized as that, I don't think that it's necessarily a lesser conflict with all the issues of today, like global terrorism and, cybersecurity and rogue states. Like these are different issues than what was faced by the country in the Cold War, but they're not necessarily lesser or worse issues. They're just different.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Korey. I think the fact that there are so many more actors today that we see, like he said, with terrorism, we're even talking about Russian politics and China. There's so many different people and countries and nations and interests working in this era that, like he said, it's a huge crisis, and it's not very comparable just because of the differences in it.
I agree entirely, and one thing it should be noted that I think the Cold War has really affected the American psyche because we're always looking for a new enemy since the Soviet Union crumbled. And, especially the situations right now, it's better off that we just leave other countries alone and let them do what they want to do. And I think we just get involved in these things for profit and for showmanship.
Right.
I think, since we go to school in America, we always see the Cuban Missile Crisis as a success for America, but, we just got the missiles out of Cuba, and they got missiles out of Turkey, plus we couldn't attack Cuba. So what do you think they would say at the time in the Soviet Union, like, if they won or they lost in that situation?
I know that because the Cuban Missile Crisis was in 1962, and then the premier Nikita Khrushchev was removed pretty much immediately afterwards, and because it didn't go well in the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, who followed Stalin, was unpopularly removed, or I guess popularly removed. I'm not sure how you word that, but the people wanted him removed, and it was in large part because the Cold War, like we all know, is about proving strength. You look strong sending Sputnik up first before the Americans can send anything, their own satellite up first. And of course we have the arms race, looking strong. The space race is all about looking strong. And the Cuban Missile Crisis made Khrushchev look weak, willing to negotiate with, the West and the Americans. So it did not go well in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and to add on to that, the guy after Leonid Brezhnev had very aggressive, foreign policy matters like sending tanks into Yugoslavia and, border skirmishes with China. So, yeah, I agree. It was seen as, a disappointment in the Soviet Union, but they attempted to rebound later on.
Okay.
Kind of piggyback off of Seth's question of kind of how the Cold War with today's events. Throughout the Cold War, there was the arms race, which kind of had led up to about 16,000 nukes today in today's world, and we're trying to lower that mantle with Obama's initiative. However, if you look at North Korea, they're not technically 93 miles away, but they've shot, I think I read they shot 4 nukes off for testing within the 21st century, and they're the only country or state in the world right now who shot off 4 nukes in the 21st century. Do you think there would be a missile crisis, not like we would have with Cuba in the future with North Korea, since they actually are trying to test their missile, or anything in the relation?
I think anything's possible with North Korea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I say something?
Oh, please, yeah,
Oh,
sorry.
yeah. I think we really have to monitor North Korea because it's an isolated nation, but it's also very underdeveloped, and a lot of what they're saying is, a lot of their materials are crumbling, and they're so way behind from the rest of the world. It's not even funny. So I think we need to keep an eye on them, but
they're just all talk, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I know that North Korea certainly hates South Korea, and they also really hate Japan because of what happened in World War II. So those nations are the only two actually in front of the United States that should maybe watch out for North Korea. Certainly they're capricious at best / worst. If there will be another nuclear standoff, my money's on the Kashmir zone between India and Pakistan, where both countries are armed and both countries absolutely despise each other, and they have for multiple decades. And I don't know, that certainly seems like they have the most, Kashmir is considered the most dangerous place on Earth, and it's because of this, and it's because it's contested territory between these two nations that bitterly despise each other.
Okay. We have a question over here.
Yes. We talk about the crumble of Russia. Do you still see them as a superpower? And then how do you view our relationship with Iran right now, based on history and trust?
Okay, you're on.
Well, in particular, Iran, I think definitely that the coup pretty much tanked our relations with Iran. The people of Iran were seriously, I guess I just feel extremely bad and I'm sad about this because the people of Iran had democracy going. They were developing into a fledgling, and they were trying to make their point, what they wanted with their country. And I think if we would have supported Mossadegh, that a lot of things would be different now. I'm not sure if, the Islamicization of the Iranian government would happen. I'm not sure if the radicalism would be prominent in Iran as it is today. And I think that's a huge thing to consider because that has also led to terrorist groups forming and, terrorism and stuff like that.
Good. I think we have time for one more question. Back.
Given we've had discussion about the CIA and its impact in the 20th century, two quick questions. One, has it done more harm than good? And two, is it outdated or is it possibly, are we able to salvage it?
I think on the has it done more harm than good? I think that definitely depends on your perspective because the CIA admittedly is a good intelligence service, and they've done a lot of their actions, whether you agree with them or not, have politically or militarily benefited the United States in a lot of circumstances. If you're looking at it from the other guy's perspective, though, which I think is important to consider, from the Iranian perspective or the Guatemalan perspective, then no, it's been extremely harmful. So,
I'd like to take a crack at this. The CIA, I'm not going to deny it's a good intelligence agency, but if you really look at it, it's done way more harm than good. It's almost like a terrorist organization, assassinating leaders and, orchestrating coups and spying on people and setting things up. And can it be salvaged today? I think it can, but there has to be dramatic reforms, especially to fit in this current century.
And I would just like to add that it being an extremely secretive organization, it could have done many harmful things that we have no idea, and it could have also done many benevolent things that we have no idea to have existed ever. I mean, it's very possible that we all could not exist now because of some James Bond character working for the CIA. And just given the very clandestine nature of the organization, I think that's something we should look at when we look at the CIA subjectively.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely important for future reform if the CIA is to succeed as a, more benevolent organization, is to remember to keep U.S. interests separate from what is going on in the country. If the country needs help with a democracy that they're trying to promote, then, you know, don't worry about the oil, or as in the case of Guatemala, like United Fruit Company, you know, things like that. If they're trying to create a better society for themselves, it is important to acknowledge that, and rather than, I guess, trash it for foreign interests and our interests, that we should just help them.
Well, I'd like to ask everybody to give one last round of applause for our presenters.
Thank you, guys.